our guides, more guides from
You're going to come occasionally to see some of what you'll see this morning. The old sweat houses and Holy Well. It was an area, and you feel it still somehow in the atmosphere here. There's an extraordinary serenity in this landscape, I think. And the name Bandaglera comes from the district Ballinagleira, all the clergy, all the priests who came from here. Very holy place. But it is a very particular place, very particular landscape, and the man to tell you about it in much more detail than I ever could is Sam Moore, archaeologist. And Sam.
Hello everybody. Can everybody hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Good. Because there is a speaker and a microphone, but I don't really know good. We do the business. Would somebody mind knocking the lights off just to take that light there? If you don't mind. Thanks for it. Hello everybody. I'm going to try and cover about 12,000 years of the past in about 40 minutes, so I'll be moving along fairly sharpish. And I believe there's tea is going to be served after my tea, before we go to the well. So if you can bombard me with questions, just try and find me in a corner and say, what were you talking about? And I'll do my best to answer any questions anybody has. So welcome to the Ardenne Mountain. It's just behind us here, Slieve on Éireann. And I'll explain why it's called the Ardenne Mountain shortly. This is looking at it from the east, and this is looking at it over Lough Allen from the Aregna Hills on the opposite side of the lake to the west. Slide there. So when you kind of think about identity and place and who we are, it's really wrapped around the landscape. It's tying us in through different periods of time, and people will alter the landscape and change. And you've got to remember that we've become very secular. But up until very recently, people's link to who they were and where they come from is tied in very much the sacred and the secular combined, often as not. That's been lost, and it's just something to put into your mind. And when you look at natural places, once a human being engages with that natural place, that place becomes encultured. So giving it a place name, giving it a story, whatever, altering it, all of these things. And one of the things I've had to use this word is liminality. I'm a big fan of this idea. And the idea of a liminal space is a place in between places. And a lot of monuments you find are often built in these kind of slightly different places, often marginal. And people engage with these spaces through work, through leisure, through living their lives. A very interesting man called Tim Ingold who talks about the ideas of these landscapes as taskscapes, where people engage with the landscape and creating identity. Slide there. So just to kind of get away from a little bit of theory for all you academic minded people here in the audience, is a guy called Christian Keller came up with these notions of a mental or cognitive landscape that's kind of tied into the idea of place and the natural or physical landscape. He talks about ideas of non-physical entities in the landscape, ideas of the oral tradition and how we come up with stories about how these places were formed and history, ideas of folklore. Are you okay there? You're kind of just, you're grand there. There's probably a place you might be able to see that's further back. So he talks about maps and place names. So where we're going to this site here. It's recorded. This is the first edition Ordnance Survey map called Tubber which is Tubber VOA, Lively Hughes Well, and then we're going up to the Sweat House, which isn't marked on the map, interestingly. But you can see where we're going later. There's a load of houses. There's two clochans here, cluster of houses. These are 18th century. There's no trace of them there today. So people would have been engaging with this place, telling stories about the well, having patterns at the well. One of the things I'm interested in is how through time space can change, or how we relate to a place can change, or even how so even how one place can have a different meaning to different people. A good example would be the Sami reindeer herders, where different groups are moving through the landscapes of Lapland. They see certain places, and one group will have identify a particular outcrop as a particular meaning or a sacred place, while another group would see the same outcrop and they'd identify a different narrative about that same place. Slide there. So I think when you combine this idea of a mental landscape, the idea of how you perceive it, with the physical space, this makes that place cultural. It makes it important. It's the thing that creates identity. This is a really great picture by Philip Burns of Slieven Iron Mountain from one of the passage tombs at Sheemore, which I'll talk about shortly. Slide. So one of these ideas about place is the notion of the She, or the good people. They're never called fairies. If you call them a fairy, something bad's going to happen to you, so I'm warning you. So they're good people. That's how they're referred to in the 17, 18, 19, 20th century, the She, or the good folk. And they're it's often, when the word She is used in Irish, it's often referring to a place, a mound, often prehistoric, but it also refers to the actual folk themselves. So it's a collective word. And it's often referring to liminal places again, these in-between places on mountaintops or caves, or magical islands, or caves under a mountain, these type of places. And it's often referring to these people, the Tuatha Dé Danann. So the Tuatha Dé Danann were the gods of Ireland who in mythology arrive in flying ships. They set up camp eventually in Tara, and a lot of Irish myths and legends are associated with their actions. Slide. So there's two very famous hills very close to us, just down to the south of us, that's Sheemore and Sheebeg, made famous. So that word She is really referring to these mounds. This is Sheebeg here, and that's Sheemore, which has three monuments on its summit. And it was made famous by the blind harpist Turlough O'Carolan, who composed it for Mr. Reynolds of Lough Score, again, which isn't very far from here. And he'd heard this story from Mr. Reynolds about a battle between two groups of the She, of the good people. One of the traditions is that it was Fionn McCool and the Fianna fighting another group, and one of the warriors of the Fianna were buried in Sheebeg, and their rivals were buried in Sheemore. So you're having this idea again of the She. These people are ever present everywhere. The idea of in folk tradition. So leprechauns, the little diminutive guys with the hammer, making shoes, and the crock of gold kind of people, they're relatively recent in folk tradition. It's really the Tuatha Dé Danann that have a much greater prevalence, the She. And they're often described, this is a George Russell painting, or A.E. So seers, or people who see visions in the 19th and early 20th century, would often describe the Tuatha Dé Danann, or the She, as tall, glimmering blue people. So they're not little green folk with wings fluttering around with magic wands that you see in Disney cartoons. They're very tall, potentially malevolent, potentially benevolent, and so you don't mess with them. And this folk tradition is really, really important all throughout this region. Slide. So I mentioned the Tuatha Dé Danann arriving in flying ships, and this is a translated piece of text by Robert McAllister, who was in UCD, from a book called Léir Gabháil na hÉireann, the Book of Invasions of Ireland. There's 5 different versions of this text, dating really from probably the 12th century. And a translation of their arrival is, it's a 6-volume translation of the different invasions. So there's the Caesarians, the Partholans, the Nemedians, the Fir Bolg, the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the Milesians. And this is the Tuatha Dé Danann's arrival. So in this way they came without vessels or barks in dark clouds over the air, by the might of Druidry, and they landed on the mountain of Connaicha Rain in Connacht, that is on the mountain of the sons of Delgade. in Conmaker Rain. We're just north of Conmaker Rain, and the mountain they're referring to is Slieve on Éireann slide. So the story is, this is a Jim Fitzpatrick painting of their arrival, and they're arriving in these magic flying ships, and they land on the summit of Slieve on Éireann. They make their way to a place called Fina, just to the south of Slieve on Éireann, before conflicting with the Fir Bolg at one of the first Battle of Maitura. But that's a whole different story, and I could give you an hour's talk just on that alone. Slide. Another important story from this area is just close to us, just past Dara, is the Shannon Pot, the source of the Shannon. It's a very complicated, there's limestone with shale covering on the mountains here, which form really complicated cave systems. So where the source of the Shannon, there's actually a whole load of very complex underwater streams and rivers, and this underwater spring is where these caves eventually interconnect, and this is the spring that bubbles up from subterranean water moving, and it's the source of the Shannon. The legend behind this, it's called Conla's Well, where a goddess called Shunnan is tempted to visit this well, because around the well there's magic hazel trees growing, and from those hazel trees there's the nuts of knowledge, and the nuts drop into the well, and there's salmon in the well that feed off the nuts. This is exactly the same story as how the Boyne in Meath is told, and the salmon of knowledge is where Phil McCool burns his finger. That's set in the Boyne, but there's a lot of these stories that are very similar. So Shunnan is the goddess that eats these nuts. She's forbidden to approach the well, and as she approaches the well comes up in flood and drowns the goddess, and her spirit then becomes one with the river, forming the biggest river in the British Isles, the River Shannon. Slide. And all of these stories and loads more are found in a number of different books that have been published by the Slieve on Éireann project, of local stories, both modern and from the past, and a lot of inspiration can be drawn from these books. Slide. Likewise, there's some fabulous great local history productions. Ballinaclera Parish, Aspects of History by Eileen Clancy and Patrick Ford. Again, Clancy and Ford's book here, and there's a 5-volume set of Leitrim folklore. If anybody here is local, this book here, I can't remember the year it was published, but I checked online, and it's on sale for $380 on Amazon.com. So if anybody has a copy,
It's in the library, in the Carrick Library.
Yeah, don't lend it to anybody, because it's actually become a very valuable book. Slide.
Sorry, Waleshka, is it Maura Clancy's book?
Yeah.
Oh, I have it.
Yeah, well done. You can will it to somebody. It's worth. There's another amazing collection of stories contained in the school's folklore collection, which are collected in the 1930s, 1937, and are housed in the Department of Folklore in UCD. These are now nearly all online, and it's through the dukas.ie website. It's an incredible collection. This story here is the origins of Slieve on Éireann and Loch Allen. So these are told by primary school children, and the best handwriter in the class would write the stories down. And so the national school, there's St. Hugh's School here, and there's a couple of national schools at Claremore that you passed on the bus that are now private homes. This one here is from Claremore near the Holywell, and it says, according to one story, 2 giants met where Loch Allen now stands and began to quarrel. Each of the giants carried a great, enormous iron sword, and after a while the swords broke into pieces and sank into the ground. As they had no swords to fight with, they threw clour at each other, which is a big clump of soil. It's my Irish. I can speak Spanish. Hay alguien que habla en español. No puedo hablar en so they fired the whatever clobber at each other, thus forming Slieve on Éireann. and the Aurigna Mountains. So the mountains are formed by these giants throwing lumps of soil, and where they were grabbing the soil from was the lake. And the Arden is that you find in the Arden Mountains is the bits of broken iron from their swords. So it's absolutely, these things are really, really powerful images written by school children less than 100 years ago. Slide. So all of these kind of stories and ideas, the folk traditions and folk life all combine to create this sense of place and a sense of identity, which is a very powerful thing in this region. Slide. I'm jumping back about 12,000 years, and Ireland looked a little bit like this maybe 20,000 years ago. We were covered in ice sheets. We had these periods of time called interstadials, where the ice sheets melt, where you get warm snaps, and things like woolly mammoth, the great Irish elk, woolly rhinoceros, hyena, wolves, bears, all of these animals were living in Ireland, but there was no humans. The earliest humans we got, thanks to the discovery by Dr. Marion Dowd here, who discovered a bear bone in Clare dating to 10,500 BC, has set back human occupation in Ireland, where we thought was 8,000 BC, but now we know that humans were here just after the ice retreats around 10,500 BC. Slide. And these ice sheets formed and sculpted the physical landscape that we see today through the process of the glaciation, but also a lot of this area is limestone, and the limestone has been eroded by water over, again, countless thousands of years, forming amazing landscapes that we see around the mountain. Slide. So this is on the west side over of Slieve an Éireann, just behind us over that direction, or the east side. So you've got a lot of blanket and raised bog, very, very dramatic landscape, very wild, and a lot of it's very empty. Slide. The ice also drops glacial erratics, boulders. So as the ice is melting, heavy rocks in the ice melt and they're deposited onto the surface, often onto little pedestals. And again, these are seen in folk traditions as something that giants threw in rock throwing contests. So this, for example, is called Fionn McCool's Rock. It's just above Drumshanbo, and it's where Fionn McCool was having a rock throwing contest and threw this big boulder. So again, a lot of folklore about these natural places. To talk about archaeology, this is a distribution map from this area. So we're up at Ballinaclare now, which is just here. And we'll be stopping off at the Holy Well and Sweat House just here on your way back. So Drumshanbo is here. And you can see that area, the slide that I show you where all the bog is, that it's pretty devoid. A lot of the red dots on the top of some of the hills are predominantly boundary markers. They were made by the Ordnance Survey when they were doing triangulation, when they were mapping Ireland at 1 inch, 6 inches to 1 mile scale back in the beginning of the 19th century. But you see there's not much going on here. Now there could be, but it's under the peat and we just haven't found anything. But there's a bit of settlement going around, but there's a huge cluster along the lakes where the Shannon Nairn Canal is today. So that's along what was the Woodford River, and then this is going over into Sligo. Slide. So there's different geologies here. It's predominantly shale, sandstones and limestones. It's the shale formation that contains the Arden, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Next slide. Around the lake though, recent surveys and previous surveys works, all of these dots are representing finds of stone tools dating back to the Mesolithic period. So the first humans in Ireland, or the ones that we know a lot about, date from 8,000 BC to 4,000 BC, and these were hunter-gatherers who were moving around the landscape, fishing, maybe hunting wild pig. We didn't have deer, there was no deer in Ireland, we're pretty sure, but predominantly looking for fish. So we know there's a lot of them around Lough Allen, and the lake levels of Lough Allen are higher today than they were back during the Mesolithic. Slide. So these are the type of tools that were found around the shores of Lough Allen. These are late Mesolithic flakes. These are things called cores, where the flakes are knocked off to make stone tools. Slide. But there were some, a few found, not many, of early Mesolithic. So the early Mesolithic's 8,000 BC to about 5,500 BC. and late Mesolithic is 5,500 to about 4,000 BC. Slide. So some of these are core axes, more cores, and jumping from the Mesolithic then. So that's all we've got from these, or there was a handful of finds. We haven't found any structures. Because they're mobile, they don't tend to leave houses. Things change in the Neolithic. When you get to the Neolithic, this is when farming arrives. This is the biggest dramatic change to how people perceive the world and engage the world once this occurs. And their most obvious is the presence of Neolithic people is through their megalithic tombs. There's 3 megalithic tomb types really from the Neolithic period. Portal tombs, passage tombs, and these things called court tombs. And there's nearly 1,500 of them dotted around Ireland. A lot of people believe that Ireland's got the greatest concentration of megalithic tombs anywhere, but actually it's Denmark. Denmark is up on maybe 30,000 megaliths. So we're really small potatoes compared to Denmark. Slide. So this is a soil map of South Leitrim. So there's Loch Allen, we're just up over here. We won't be going to this because it's overgrown and difficult to see. Clettenmore Court Tomb. Well, you can see there's a cluster down here. This is Sheemore, this is Sheebeg, and this is the area around Fina. What's interesting is they seem to be putting the monuments on very particular soil types and where there's lots of rock outcrops, particularly Fina. Slide. So just to tell you a little bit about the court tomb. Court tombs are called courts because they have what appears to be a ritual area in the front, with a gallery divided up into chambers where burials are put. We might call these maybe something akin to parish churches. Perhaps it might be an interesting analogy. Although they have burials, they're places with burials rather than perhaps places for burials. They're very different ideas. Slide. So the only one in this area is this site. You can see it's in not great shape, but it's now all overgrown. It's in a field boundary wall. There's the boundary wall there. And you can see the traces of the court area in front of it, leading into a gallery divided into, in this case, 3 chambers. This hasn't been excavated, but if it were, you'd find domestic type of pottery, arrowheads, javelin heads, the type of things people would use on a daily basis. Slide. What's more interesting are for me anyway, because this is what my passion is, I suppose, is passage tombs. There's 4 main passage tomb clusters in Ireland. The Newgrange group in the Boyne Valley, Lough Crew in Meath, Carrowkeel and Carrowmore in County Sligo. But these dots here on the map is the cluster of passage tombs at Fina, Sheemore and Sheebeg. Next slide. This is the summit of Slieve an Éireann, and as you drove here today and as you drive back, Slieve an Éireann is an incredibly distinctive mountain. It stands out. It's got dramatic cliffs pretty much surrounding the entire mountain. And on the summit, I kind of find this interesting. I can't answer why, but there's nothing on it. On the summit of Quilca Mountain in Fermanagh, not far from here, over at Kilronan Mountain, not too far from Keeju, there's passage tombs on the top. There's passage tombs down up at Fina. There's passage tombs down at Cornhill and Longford. So they often want to put the passage tombs on the top of distinctive mountains with big vistas. While up on the top of Slieve an Éireann, there's a buried trig point. This is where the Ordnance Survey back in the 70s put these things to make maps. But then a couple of years later, the Americans invented GPS, and these were redundant. Next slide. So this is the highest mountain in Ulster in Slieve Donard in County Down. I was involved in some research on this mountain. This is the passage tomb on the summit. It's got dramatic views. This is the view looking from the southwest to west, and from the summit, this is nearly 100 kilometres away. You can see Slieve an Éireann. So it's an interesting question, I think, why isn't there a mountain on the summit of Slieve an Éireann? Perhaps, tentatively, the mountain might have been seen as significant in other ways and you're not supposed to build a monument on it. I don't know. Slide. However, to the south west of Slieve an Éireann, there's Slieve an Éireann there, is this hill, Sheemore. And it's got 3 cairns on it. 2 of them have been dug into, but we don't know what was found. And then the large cairn has a big, whopping great big floodlit crucifix that was put up with great pomp and ceremony. A few thousand people climbed Sheemore for the inauguration of this cross in the Holy Year in 1952 slide. But it's part of a really interesting collection of slides. There's two smaller cairns, and then this is the big cairn with the cross, and they're enclosed in a nearly 100 metre by 60 metre diameter enclosure. You can see old field walls and cultivation ridges dotted around the hill. Nobody's done any proper research on this, so it'll be really good at some stage in the future that maybe one of our students in IT Sligo will take this on to maybe do some extra work slide. And it's very dramatic. It's you can see it for a long way, particularly when the cross is illuminated, obviously. But it is a very dramatic thing. So for miles, like when you're up at Carrowkeel in South Sligo and look back, you can see this. If you ever go, if any of you know the chieftain up in the Curlews, and you stand up there, you can see this. If you're up on Cornhill in County Longford, where there's a big TV mast, you can see this really clearly. You can see this for miles, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's there. Again, it's one of these liminal places, touching the sky and connecting the different cosmologies. Slide, and then just down, you can see it relating to Turlough O'Carolan's tune is the Passes to him at She Beg. They're intervisible. You can see one from the other, and this is the inspiration where the two fairy hosts go into battle, and this is the song of Turlough O'Carolan. It was dug into in 1931 by a school teacher from Swanlinbar, and he describes finding a thing called a brain ball and two skeletons. Now the museum don't have these. I went to have a look at what was in the collection, and all there is two mandibles, two lower jaws. I can't tell if it's male or female. The brain ball is a weird thing. A brain ball is when you it's kind of part of a 19th century folk tradition. It's where you kill your enemy, you take their brain out, you dry it in lime, and it turns into a ball that you can throw at people and hurt them. It could be that this brain ball is actually, you get these polished stone balls in Passes tombs, and that's what it might be actually referring to, but we don't know where it is. It's only two mandibles that ended up in the museum slide. The other things are portal tombs, which are very dramatic. These are again early Neolithic. The Passes tombs are a bit later. They're middle Neolithic, from 3500 BC to about 2900 BC. The court tombs and portal tombs are around 3750 BC up to about 3500 BC. And again, the type of things that you find in these are human remains with domestic type of grave goods. But they're very dramatic because of these impressive big capstones. And you can see there's a cluster of them in South Leitrim slide. One of the best ones is at Fina, which I'll show you in a minute, and this is one just at Scoremore Lake, just above it, slide. And this is the one at Fina. Has a little cool haircut, maybe turn it into a mohawk and get it pretty funky looking. So this is the portal tomb of Fina, very dramatic. Often the biggest one is Grounds Hill in Carlow. It's got a 100-ton capstone, really, really incredible. While this thing here is probably about 30 tons. So it's a lot of effort, and it brings communities together. Again, it's about this idea of identity. By building this and constructing it, you could have hundreds of people dragging this stone and then lifting it up with scaffolding, etc. This is when there's no metal, so everything is done with stone or wooden tools. Slide. This site at Fina is one of my favourite spots in South Leitrim. It's not too far. I have loads of favourite spots though. Fina is a remarkable place because it's got a huge amount of folk tradition and stories and amazing archaeology. There's Passes tombs, court tomb, portal tomb, early field systems, massive cashels. There's Bronze Age barrows. There's ringed. It's incredible. I excavated a ring ditch with Chris Reid a few years ago. An incredible place. It's got two churches. One of them holds it's said to hold the remains of Saint Colleen, who's the saint who founded the monastic site at Fina. So you have a medieval church and then a monastery on the hill, which is 15th century, was re-established. Slide. A text was written by St. Colleen. This started deteriorating, and then in the 16th century, in 1516, it was recopied. It was redone by Tygo Roddy, who was the co-arb, or he was one of the monks at Fina. So it's a 500-year anniversary of this. There's been a lot of celebrations in Fina about this, and exhibitions in the Royal Irish Academy where the book is held today. And it documents the life of St. Colleen, amongst other things. The new 1516 updated version, because this is written on animal skin, and if it's not kept in the right conditions, the animal skin starts to degrade, and you have professional scribes, itinerant scribes who travel around Ireland writing. They're basically medieval photocopiers, and they go and they copy some of these manuscripts. One of them actually, I won't go into that anyway, because I've gone off on a tangent and I want a cup of tea. But one of them contains the story of Conall Gulban. So the St. Colleen is actually from Galway, but there's a strong connection between Fina and Donegal, and it's really through the Conall Kennel, who were the Irish name for Donegal is Tir Conall, and this relates back to the founding ancestor, a guy called Conall Gulban. So Ben Bulben in Sligo is named after this guy, Conall Gulban, and Tir Conall in the county of Donegal is named after the same guy. And he's fighting a crowd from a place called Maishlecht over in Cavan, and he dies, and he's buried in Fina. So it's Fina and Donegal are intrinsically linked. So is there any O'Donnells?
Yes.
There is an O'Donnell. So your ancestors are all tied into this. So the O'Donnells of Tir Conall, Reggie O'Donnell and the like, are all related to this manuscript. And it was part of their inauguration. So when the O'Donnells were inaugurated, the monks from Fina would travel to North Donegal to attend the inauguration of the head of the O'Donnells. Slide. Also there was is St. Colleen's Shrine. This was eventually moved from Fina to St. Mel's Cathedral in Longford, and then tragically in 2009 St. Mel's Cathedral burnt down, and this burnt with it. It's been conserved, so they haven't restored it, they've conserved it. That's the proper practice. But it did look like this. Now it was badly damaged in the fire. It's dating to 1536. It's probably a book shrine, but some think it might have held relics, because we know that in the life of St. Colleen, traditionally he went to Rome, where, like many Irish saints, he got a bit of St. Peter, St. Lawrence, St. Matthew and St. Paul. I think if you added up all the Matthew, Paul and Peter relics that are knocking around Europe, there's about maybe 300 or 400 people. But apparently, so it might have held the relics from Rome, or more likely it was holding the original book. Slide. Also from Fina is this cool thing called Clucknaree, the Bell of the Kings. This is what the decoration on its mount looks like. It's bronze. It's probably 10th or 11th century. And tradition is that it was used to baptize. You could ring it as a bell to call people to prayer, but also that it held 1.5 pints of water, and you could baptize people with it. So there's a whole load of different kings, including this pseudo-mythical king, the founder of the O'Donnells, Conall Gulban. Interestingly, there's a story where fill it up 3 times, so 1.5 pints volume of gold and 30 horses were given to Fina at the death of one of the abbots there, Wynyock, Morton Wynyock. Slide. So again, interesting. Back with the folklore, the story is that a guy called Connacht the Fearless was living at a cashel site at Fina, and didn't like this Christian malark at all. This monk coming in telling us to believe in this God, not happy with it, and he set all his druids on St. Colleen, and St. Colleen, of course, being a super duper miracle worker, turned them all into stones. So the enclosure around the church is possibly early medieval ecclesiastical enclosure, but the tradition has turned it into the site of Conning the Fearless, who doesn't like Catholicism or doesn't like Christianity. So all around Feenagh there's all these standing stones. But again, it's going back to the folklore. The folklore is explaining why these stones are present. I'm not going to dwell on this, but just to point it out, there is a theory that you get these things, it's called in folk tradition the Black Pig's Dyke or the Worm Ditch, and it's said to travel all the way across. It's to keep the crazy Irish people out of Ulster, is the kind of crazy idea that people had. But it's meant to travel. There's been a couple of sites. It goes up through different lake systems and eventually comes out at Ballyshannon. So there has been a bit excavated at Ballyshannon, and there is a stretch travelling up to Loch Melvin. There is a tentative bit of it around Loch Allen, but it hasn't been found. This is questionable, a site just at Dara, just north of here. But again, these linear earthworks were probably to stop large-scale cattle raiding. To stop people coming into your territory, robbing your cattle, and then herding the cattle away from you. It's possibly dating back to the Iron Age, to about maybe 200 BC. Slide. To jump into the most common field monument there is in the country, there's 40,000 of these. These are dating to around, on average, around the 7th century AD. So all of these black dots represent a monument. It's the most common monument you get. And these are the so-called fairy forts or ring forts. Slide. So these are circular enclosures with a ditch around them so they're basically middle-class farmsteads, would be a way to describe them. The yellow dots represent the distribution of where they're found around Loch Allen. So these are circular enclosures. So these are farmers, and this is where they keep their family, some of their animals, farm equipment. But they're self-sufficient, so there's evidence for metalworking and all kinds of things going on in these slides. Where you get stony areas, like north of the lake here, those yellow dots are showing where you get cashels. So they're the stone equivalent of these earthen ring forts. This is one just near Dara slide. And these form a really important part again in folk tradition. They're called fairy forts. You don't mess with them. You don't interfere with them. It's really bad luck if you dig into one. All your cattle will get sick. There's a whole load of again stories. You can see here that when they built the road, there's no way they're going to go through it. They go around it. So these again are really important sites. Unfortunately, possibly thousands of these were destroyed in the last 60, 70 years with land clearances. And a lot of it's because of folk tradition, a lot of them are preserved. That's why we have over 40,000 slides.
Have you heard of any bad happenings afterwards?
All the time. All the time. So another common monument, there's only one, or there's two of them on Loch Allen. There might be more because the lake levels have risen. So there could be submerged ones. There's two recorded, but dotted all around these in the Drumlin Swarm, along the Woodford River, along Loch Score, Garradese Loch. There's Cranogs Loch, the lake at Feenagh. So all these yellow dots are Cranogs slide. And these are man-made artificial islands, probably dating to the same time as the ring forts and cashels. Some of them are a bit later. I was very fortunate to work on a dating program with the Discovery program of the South Leitrim Cranogs, where we sampled timbers from these, and the majority came back at 10th to 12th century dates. So they're slide. So this is a replica of one. So they're man-made islands. Often they're overlooked by big enclosures like this bivalent ring fort or trivalent ring fort overlooking this site in Armagh. This is one at Keju, and we know that people were living on this up until the 16th century. One of the scribes that were associated with the church there. Slide. Just a little thing I came across while I was researching this talk, and I thought it was really interesting. This is called a separate blade wooden shovel, dating to around the 10th century. And there's only 35 of them known in Western Europe. They're really, really unusual, and they're made out of wood. It was found in Loch Allen. near Drumshanbo during dredging works in 1889. I just put it up there because I thought it was kind of a quirky, unusual thing, and they're very rare slide. I'll just very quickly talk to you about the there's a possible early monastic site out here. So we're just up at Ballinaclera here, and just not far from us, we've got St. Hugh's National School, St. Hugh's Church, there's St. Hugh's Well, St. Hugh's River. St. Hugh is the man. This is St. A, St. Vio A, Lively Hugh, who's said to have established a monastery on the island of Inishmagua in the 6th century. The site was used up until the 18th century, and it was moved then to Kilbride, which is over towards getting closer to Drumkeerdon. So it moves over in the early 18th century. So he was said to have found a monastery here, another one at Fahy, which I don't know if there's a burial ground just by the lake overlooking Inishmagua, and that's meant to be said to be the burial site of St. Hugh, who was traditionally buried there around 524 AD. Slide. Just very close to Inishmagua is one of the only tower houses in the area. So this area was controlled by the O'Rourke's of Breffni, was the main king of this entire region. And the Maconsavas were one of their vassals. So the kind of Gaelic lord of this region, the name actually turned into the Fords. So it's called Ford's Castle. It was most likely looking like this. There's hardly any trace of it today, just very low rubble foundations. And adjacent to it, there's a kind of a almost rectangular shaped enclosure, which is a moated site which predates the tower house. So in the Annals of the Four Masters, his wooden house, which was probably contained in one of these moated sites, was burnt in 1530, and then he replaced it with building something like this, a tower house castle, in the early 16th century, and then this was destroyed during the rebellion in the early 1640s, said to be destroyed by Sir Frederick Hamilton. So Manor Hamilton is up that way, and that's where Sir Frederick Hamilton built a massive big castle. But he burnt it down. He actually burnt down a whole load of places, but the Irish burnt down a load of places too. Slide. This is the site we're going to go to. So this, the Yellow River was called the River of VOA, which is St. Hugh, and this is his holy well, which we'll have a look at later. It's one of about 3,000 holy wells in the country, and I'll talk about more when we get there. Slide. So to jump into Arden, getting into a kind of slightly more modern period, this is what they were looking for. This is the Arden nodules that initially most of the importance of this area for Arden production was for searching for these things. This was siderite nodules, which forms in the shale rocks. This is what it looks like if you're wandering around hill walking. You see them sticking out of rocks, and with weathering and glaciations, these get washed out of the rocks, or then humans would quarry them, and they go into stream beds. So people were searching the stream beds for these rocks because they got 40% pure Arden in them. Very good. So there's a lot of the shales then, and later in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, the rocks were quarried to get the Arden ore out. But initially, it's these things that people were looking for, these Arden nodules. And that's where the mining starts around this region. Slide. I'm going to break a myth here. I'm sorry, everybody. There's a big story. Sorry. So, Sam the Mythbuster. There's absolutely zero evidence. I'm sorry that the Arden in the Halfpenny Bridge in Dublin came from Slieve and Éireann. I'm afraid it's highly unlikely, because it was forged in Shropshire. It's hardly likely that they got the Arden ore from Slieve and Éireann, brought it all the way to the River Severn, to Shropshire, founded it there, made it, and then brought it back to Dublin. So it's most likely that the Arden in this bridge is from England. Sorry about that. Amazing. It's a good story though. So, built in 1816, and to replace a ferry that went across the Liffey, and the guy who owned the ferries wanted compensation, so there was a fee of half a penny to cross. That was the same fee to get the ferry across the Liffey. So that's, sorry about that, slide there. But part of the Arden Works, there's very few remnants of the Arden Works around Slieve on Erne. A lot of the mountains, the Rigna Mountains, the mountains down to the north of us, and Slieve on Erne, and gone into the Playbank, all contains these Arden nodules. But one of the biggest surviving things is the Furnace Tower at Creevy Lee, which is very close to Drumcairden. Originally built by Sir Charles Coote around 1621. This was destroyed during the 1641. This is one of the places the Irish destroyed. Sir Frederick Hamilton then comes and destroys the places that, so they're 1641 rebellion. It was rebuilt, closed again, and the reason why it closed again was because they'd cut down all the trees here. They needed charcoal. So the English were clearing forests anyway from the Elizabethan period to stop the Irish hiding in the forests and using the forests as a way to attack English troops in guerrilla warfare. So there was and they were shipping the trees over for the growing English navy. But then when they started smelting, they were using charcoal. But at around 1700, somebody came up with the idea you can actually use coke. You can use coal to fuel smelting. So that's when the coal production started around here, particularly around the Rigna. So it's kind of hard to imagine when all you see there today is that, but it was actually colossal. There were stables for 30 horses and 10 cottages for labourers, like a hive of activity up until its closure at the end of the 19th century. There is one very close to here, one site which is probably mid-18th century in site, where there's traces of Arden working mainly in the form of slag for production, but also through vitrified material. It kind of looks very glass-like, and there's a tradition that the Arden that they were making was used to make pikes that were used in the 1798. That might or might not be true. We know that General Humbert, one of the French, the leader of the French that invaded Ireland in 1798, passed over on the opposite side of Loch Arrow, or Loch Allen, so he was very close to her. So there are places dotted around the mountain that still have production sites. I'm going to jump back to this because I just came across a little interesting thing about bathing. This is the bell again, and the book shrine, but the bell and the book shrine would be processed. So particularly when a king is inaugurated, the priests would in a lot of pomp and ceremony, the number is 12 priests, and they processed all around a huge territory, carrying these relics of St. Colleen. This is really important, really profound. But for anybody to get near these relics, they had to pay. So the fee of the bell of the kings, from every king, when Colleen's people go with it, the steed of each king, so they get a horse, with his clothes, so they get some clothes, a scrapple, and a scrapple I discovered is a silver coin weighing 24 grains of wheat. So every house that the bell goes into has to pay this. And there would be smoke, bathing and ablution, which is foot washing. So the bathing bit I thought was interesting, because bathing keeps coming up in a lot of these early texts. Slide. So bathing brings me into these things, which are undated. We don't know how old they are. The earliest written account, because none has actually been physically excavated to get dating material from, the earliest reference we have is a late 18th century French reference, a French guy who travels around Ireland, and he tries one of these out, which I'll talk about when we go up and see the sweat house. But there's a huge amount. There's 240 in the Republic of Ireland, with nearly 100 alone in County Leitrim. So like an incredible amount of these sweat houses, and I'll explain how they worked when we get up there. But bathing was it's a dry air sauna site. To talk a little bit about transport, I'm nearly finished, and then we can have our tea. I'm gagging for a cup of tea. Just talk about water transport. There has been a few dugout canoes found around Lough Allen. Some of them are left in situ. Well, the museum is notified because to take the dugout canoe, you've got to preserve it in a thing called peg. It's really costly. So they'd often just sample the boat, take some timber from it to get a date out of the boat. So they can't date anything period from the Mesolithic onwards, but the two boats that have been found, dugout canoes, mainly out of oak planks, one of them dates to 446 AD and the other one dates to 1527 AD. So these have been used all the way through from the Mesolithic right up into the medieval period. Slide. And to continue on about transport, Lough Allen got its canal in 1822. And this connects Lough Allen and the steel and the iron works that were around, and the coal works that were around Lough Allen, connected it onto the biggest river, onto the Shannon, which could connect to the Royal Canal that would get you to Dublin. So this is the way things were transported. They then had a great idea of building a canal to link the Shannon into the River Erne, along the part of the Woodford River, through the different lakes, Lough Garradise, Lough Score, etc. But it was a bit of a disaster. They spent years doing it. It was thousands of pounds over budget, and you can see there 8 boats used it between 1860 and 1869. Like, it was a complete disaster. So it closed, and the railways opened shortly afterwards. Anyway, interestingly, now today the railways are gone and the canal is back with a bang, and it's now busy. It's a gorgeous thing to do, to travel by a barge or boat along the Shannon Erne. A bit different, 227,000 in 1858 to 30 million in 1994. Slide. While they were dredging for the canal, though, just to point out this, they found this beautiful Ardent Age bowl called the Kershcarrigan bowl. It was probably made in Britain based on the style of the bird head decoration. There's some zigzags and lozenges inside on the lip. Made of bronze and probably turned on a lathe. There's a chuck mark on its base that was probably, so it was held onto something. So this is pretty amazing, and it might be related to activity going on in this area during the Ardent Age. Slide. Particularly at this place called Maeslecht. So this is Lough Garradise here. It's not far from here at all. It's in Cavan. But dotted around this area are a huge collection of prehistoric monuments. This is an Ardent Age hilltop enclosure. The Killy Cluggan stone is an Ardent Age decorated stone that was smashed and destroyed. So this is a place called Maeslecht, which means the plain of prostrations, or the plain of adoration. This is the complex of Crom Cruach, this really nasty sounding Ardent Age deity, that St. Patrick. He comes along to this place where a sanctuary was and smashed the idols of Crom into the ground. This was smashed, or was found smashed in a pit adjacent to a wedge tomb. And it could be relating to this story that these were seen as idols and had to be destroyed. So this is where St. Patrick comes and banishes the idols of Crom. All happened just outside Ballyconnell. Slide there. So that was just a little aside there about the Ardent Age. The railways then came after the collapse really of the canals now, but they needed to get their coal and needed to get their Ardent out. So the Arigna to Ballyconnell line or Ballinamore line was opened, that went through Drumshambo to get the coal out. It was chaired by the Earl of Kingston, who lived at Kilronan Castle, just on the other side of the Arigna Mountains. A narrow gauge railway, and it's really for the steel and iron to get out. So the men up at Arigna, where the main coal mines were, would in really difficult conditions mine the coal, bring them on horses to the railway line, slide, and then the railway line, this is the Arigna train, this would then shuttle the coal and then get onto the main line to Dublin or wherever it was being. But a lot of this coal then was being used in furnaces and then later in the power plant that formed in Lough Allen. And this is the old railway station in Drumshanbo. So it's the railway line here. This hasn't changed. Next slide. So it's still the same. That's the waiting room. This is the only new bit, and the road obviously. Now if you just jump back a slide, so you can see the water tower, the waiting room, and then these sheds are still there as well. So when you're driving back out in the bus, you'll pass. So the railway line is obviously gone. Slide. So I think all of these things convey the idea, I hope, that a quote from John McGahern, that what the landscape actually does, it's how it makes you feel, how you engage with it, how you interact with it, your day-to-day life. So landscape and the sentiment of how you feel about landscape and all the stories and places within that landscape combine to create us and who we are. Slide. Thanks very much. Stream that's flowing beyond us there it is now called the Yellow River, but it was called Elm VOA or Hughes River, and as you can see, the Yellow River name is apt. The spring is coming up, really clean water, but the yellow staining is from the iron minerals that are coming out of the bedrock here. So, did people get a handout? Yeah. What's interesting about the handout is that handout is from the 1836 16th to 1 mile ordnance survey map. It marks the well. It's called Tubber Buoy, so that's VOA anglicised into Buoy. So so it's useful to have. They're not far from settlement. So you might find a holy well that appears to be very far away from things, but if you often check on the map, they're not. They're right in the heart of a community. Not always. It really depends when they're used for. I'm really interested in these things. There's about 3,000 of them recorded in Ireland, and over 70 in Leitrim. Some of them are still in use, and some of them have gone out of use, and all they are is muddy pools. So sometimes you get saints local. If it's a local saint, there'll be a patron day. So it could be around March, November, various times of the year. I think this guy is March 18th, near Paddy's Day, but I could be wrong. And people would assemble here, and they do perform stations. So at some wells you might get a pile of rocks, and people add a stone to the pile of rocks, and you get these little, they're called penitential cairns. But most wells are used for cures. So some kind of pilgrimages or assemblies at these sacred sites around the Irish landscape, there's two forms. There's one where you want something good to happen to you, or the other one is that you get relieved of sin. So you get penitential pilgrimages. So the most famous one in Ireland is the Luna Assembly climbing Croagh Patrick. So a lot of pilgrims come there, and it's a hard thing to do, particularly barefoot. You're meant to walk from Ballintubber Abbey and walk all the way to Croagh Patrick and then climb barefoot, and you do the station. So that's to alleviate sin. Coming to things like this, to wells, is to gain a cure. So the water, or sometimes rocks, there might be rocks positioned around, like for example in County Louth there's a collection of places at St. Bridget's Well, and there's a thing called the headache rock, and it's a kind of a curved shaped rock, and you lean your head against it, and that cures your headache or hangover, whatever the case might be. At Tubernalt in Sligo there's an altar, and the rocks are kind of have an unusual shape, and you lean your back against it, and it's a cure for a backache. There's another holy well over at Kilronan where Turlough O'Carroll, the harpist, is buried, and there's a loch there. There's a big flagstone up on 4 pillars, and you're meant to climb underneath the rock, to cure your backache or make your backache worse. You don't really know. So at a lot of wells you do stations. So there might be a holy tree or a couple of holy trees or a holy stone, and then the well. The well is the focus. So people would circumambulate, they'd walk in circles saying decades of the rosary, they'd walk in circles around the well. They might leave an offering in the form of a coin, in the form of a rag, in the form of rosary beads, a crucifix, a little plastic statue. So you can see there's rags here, there's rags there. There might be some more on other trees. They're often on hollies or haws. The most famous place is Fore in County Westmeath, where it has the 7 miracles of Fore. The water flows uphill, the wood never burns. There are all kinds of amazing, miraculous things that makes the place even more sacred. So like I said, some are still in use today, like Tubernalt in Sligo. If you go there, that's a Garland Sunday assembly. So at dawn, there's a dawn mass. You do the stations at the well. Last time I was there for a dawn mass, there was maybe close to 3,000 people. So 30,000 people go Croagh Patrick, but a lot of these places still attract pilgrims. Both Christian pilgrims, and what's more interesting is in the last, say, 30 years with the New Age movement, is that these are seen as pagan womb openings. So it's the earth goddess, and the life-giving force of water is coming from the earth. So a lot of New Age ideas get associated with these, mixed up with the Christian ideas. So you'd still go to wells. So those rags could be from a New Age idea, or they could be a Christian idea. But the idea of leaving the rag or leaving something behind equates to the illness or the worry or the problems that you're having. So the idea is that the well is gives this regenerative properties. It renews things. So a lot of holy wells, some people believe they're pagan. There's big problems with that. The biggest problem is that I was chatting to somebody earlier who believed that the Romans never came to Ireland. But the Romans were here, not in big numbers, mainly as tradesmen. There's 2 holy wells, both in County Meath, that were one in Tipperary and one in Meath, Golden in County Tipperary, where there was a lead roll it was called an oculus stamp. It was a stamp in Latin saying that if the person who had this, if they put a clay onto their eyes, it would cure an eye complaint. That's Roman, and the inscription was Latin. It was Roman Latin. So this is in Goldens in County Tipperary, where there's a Roman healer, and this lead object was deposited into a well. Now the Romans loved their wells. The problem is that what happens is in Gaul, where the Celts, or the so-called Celts were, when the Romans conquered them, they start venerating wells. It's actually a Roman influence. So they might have venerated the wells, but they don't really do much at them. It's the Romans who encourage this. So Aqua Minerva in Bath is a Roman foundation, but it's mixed in with Ardent Age using tribes around the Bath region, because there's a lot of kind of Celtic iconography and symbolism of Ardent using things. So the idea that these are pagan in origin is very questionable. The pagan ones actually might be influenced by Roman activity, because another one where there was a toiletry tool found for earwax cleaning was found at a well in Meath, and that was Roman object again. We won't stay long, the midgets are coming out. But a lot of them occur close to churches, so they might have been used for baptism. But recent research is kind of suggesting that the majority of them are dating to the 16th century. And they're not pre-Christian, and they're not early Christian. Some obviously were used for baptisms. But evidence is strongly suggesting that they're counter-Reformation, that following the whole collapse of the Roman Catholic and the Vatican, after Martin Luther nailed his bulls in protest against indulgences and all the crazy stuff, and the kind of crazy, kind of mad sex parties and orgies that the different popes would host in the Vatican. That Martin Luther said, this is crazy, this isn't the right way to be Christian. So you had the Great Schism, and the Catholic Church then they came up with the idea, it was called the Council of Trent, and the Counter-Reformation happened. And at the same time, Ireland had gone through the Tudor conquest, and the monasteries dissolved, bishops and priests persecuted, and the Protestant religion starts coming in. Then certainly after the Treaty of Mellifont and the defeat at Kinsale, but really from 1641 after the rebellion, and then by the time Cromwell comes, that Protestantism is now on a massive rise, and you get into the penal times when you're not allowed to vote if you're a Catholic, you're not allowed to own a weapon, you're not allowed to have a sword. There's a whole load of, and priests are persecuted and they have to go to hidden places to say Mass. That's when these things come to the fore. And popular Catholicism, that there's no direction from Rome. Ireland has almost become isolated from what's happening in Rome in many respects. And communities start inventing their own traditions and beliefs. So Christian traditions at places like this, to me and some other scholars, believe that they're really originating post-Counter-Reformation from the 17th century, but certainly in the 18th century. So there's question marks about them, and until you actually excavate, and the other thing about them is that they're springs. We call them wells, but they're actually springs. And in limestone areas, springs move. So if we come back in 300 years, this might be down over there, because the water's changing, and all the kind of geology is making things alternative and different. So this is I think it's a nice example. It's kind of tucked away. It's pretty, apart from the midges. So we'll head up to the sweat house. So people would, like I said, perform circuits and leave an offering and maybe take holy water with them, or clay. My wife is I'm not a New Age hippie or a Christian. My wife dabbles in it, and she's after giving me a bag of rags. If people would like to leave a rag as an offering, my beautiful assistant here has a little bag. So this is a really good example of a sweat house. And like I said, we don't really know when they date from. Because there's similarities between these and ones you find in Scandinavia, and we know that the Vikings practiced the same ideas using sweat house. There was a thought that they were Viking in origin. But the fact that they turn up in places that we're fairly sure the Vikings never got to, it might have been that they introduced it and the idea stayed and people copied it. But we really don't know the dates. And like I said, the text that I gave you as a handout, that's the earliest description and earliest reference to a sweating house, as this French traveller calls it. Really interesting book. Archive.org it's called. It's a website. You can download any book that's out of copyright. So you can actually download his book. It's fascinating. So this Frenchman's walking tour of Ireland, really interesting thing. So he describes it quite succinctly. It's quite humorous in some ways. He says that the fell shelter here, i.e. the ducks and geese belonging to the farmers, would shelter there when it's not in use. But they'd light a fire sometimes for days. And there's records of sweat house itinerants, of men that would travel around places like this, because we have such a density of sweat houses in Leitrim, particularly around this area, that there's records in other parts of the country of itinerants that would travel from community to community. And if you look at the map, you can see that there was two groups of cottages here. There's a group here, no trace of them. So these are 18th century farmsteads, and then a big clocken just to the south of us. So that's who were using these. But you have people travelling around, and they'd light the fires and tend the fires 2 to 3 days, heating up all the stone on the interior, and then they rake it out and line it with rushes. They get planks of wood then, so people would strip naked, and both men and women, according to the different accounts, and they'd sit inside anything, you had to have more than 2 because there's a health and safety warning. Because it can get mega hot from all the accounts. It can really be baking. It's dry heat.
People have died.
So there's stories about people dying. So you have to have 2 people, and there's other records of up to 7. Now I don't know, this probably isn't big enough for 7. If you have a peep inside, I have a little torch on my keyring. So you can imagine maybe 4 people sitting inside, and they stay in there for maybe 4 or 5 hours. Now that's a long time. And that's it. Then it would have to be reheated. So a fire would have to be get going again to get the stones going. And from all the accounts I've read, and they're mainly 19th century accounts, like I said, the earliest one is the one I gave you, is that they put their clothes back on and go back to work. That's it. But there's other accounts where they go and they lie down in bed for a bit and then they go back to work. And then there's a couple of accounts that they get out and there's a plunge pool. So they sweat, and that's the best way to do it, if those of you have ever tried a sauna, is you perspire and then you hot it and your pores close up. And so they might, a lot of the sweat houses I visited are beside streams. So it could be that there might have been a pool to plunge into afterwards. But like I said, all the accounts, so you come in, you perspire, there's a whole load of different cures. The main one that is repeated all the time is rheumatism. So aching joints, joint pains. So they're cures and they're a form of bath because you sweat out impurities. And it was seen as a popular medicinal way to have cures, particularly of joint aches and muscle strain.
Was it not at all used for spiritual purification before a ceremonial rite?
This doesn't seem to be any. So unlike Native American sweat lodges, these seem to be just solely for health reasons, and there doesn't seem to be any religious connotations at all, which is interesting. And like I said, there's 240 in Ireland and 100 here. You know, so there's in this area, just around this lake. So there's it was a really popular thing. This entire region. So it kind of looks all muddy and stuff, but you gotta imagine it would have been raked out. So it's traditionally turf. So they literally light a fire of turf, and that's tended. So again, in this particular area, I came across a couple of accounts where there was a group of women from the different villages, and they take it in turns to go and tend the fire. So they'd light the fire, go do chores, then come back. Another woman would go up a few hours later, keep the fire going, a couple of days, and then it's ready to be used. So it's raked out, cleaned out. You line it with reeds and rushes and branches, leaves, hop inside for a few hours, seal it off. They put a plank of wood or branches and cover it with their clothing and sit in there for 3 or 4 hours. So sweat.
Associated with like the coal miners who have been coal down?
Well, yeah. Well, it seems to be all about any worker, because they're all labourers. You know, they're all farming the land or they're farming the mines or mining around. With a lot of the miners, the ardent miners in particular, they'd look for, at some points in time, they'd look for those big nodules and sell them. And other times of the year they're farming. So they're like part-time workers in the mines. You get paid by the weight as well. It's the same with the coal miners, they got paid by the weight. So they'd have a little. Has anybody been to the Arigna mine? Like, it's brilliant. It's really good. I highly recommend it. For those who haven't gone, it's a fabulous thing. Before all the guides die, because they're going to, because all the guides are former miners. It's just a brilliance.
Where was the fire?
Anywhere around here, anywhere outside. Oh no, the fire was inside. Oh, inside, yeah. And then it would be, they'd burn, they heat it up for days. And then the stone is all absorbing the heat. And then they drag the ashes out, put rushes down on the floor so it's clean. And then the people come in and it's just, the stones are the thing that are baking hot. There's no, I came across one reference where they'd splash water onto the stones, so it's steam. But 99 out of 100 times, all the records are it's dry heat. No steam. No, it's no rituals. No, well, the itinerant ones did. Yeah, they'd be paid a few pennies. So their job was to travel to the different sweat houses, light them up, tending the fires, and then people would pay to use the sweat house. Anytime. No. Cleansing the body. Yeah. Notions of hygiene were very different. Yeah. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you.